Yeah,
And
so
I missed last week. What paragraph were we on?
246 is where we are.
Cool.
And I'd like to pull right through this today. Good evening, everyone. We are live in the Carl Jung Psychology reading group. We are reading from volume 7 of the collected works of C.G. Jung in a topic called the persona as a segment of the collective psyche. And we've been talking about this for about 3 weeks now. Hopefully we'll finish this chapter tonight. And then we can get into the juicy stuff, which is negative attempts to free the individuality from the collective psyche, which is no doubt a kind of shadow story. And my favorite conversation partner is here, and hopefully some others will arrive. We usually get good folks to join us on the YouTube chat and on Monday nights. And so let's see, I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of information here. One is, let's see, maybe I'm not going to give you that. I can give you the Dropbox for the Carl Jung Psychology reading group, so you can get to that. And that's always nice because it contains all of the collected works of C.G. Jung. So if you have an interest in that, you're not going to have to spend $500 to get the collected works. That's normally appreciated. And let's see, I'm going to also give you the MailChimp address so that you can register to participate in this panel with us if you wish to. And that is the link for that. And so if you wish to join us, please do. And the one other thing that I'm going to give you is our confluence for this summer. Some of us are meeting in Helena, Montana on the 10th to 14th of June. And we're going to have a hell of a time up there because it's all people who know something about Jungian psychology, and so we are going to have an incredibly numinous time together, and synchronous, numinous and synchronous. I don't know what the synchronicities will be. We have to live it to
have to find them.
Have to find what they are, but they will be there for sure in this group. It'll be truly frightening.
Yeah, nice. Well, I have to say, in the last year, I slowed down to a different pace, going slow to go slower to go faster, and it's interesting because I think the synchronicities are always there. This year, I was surprised in the first 6 months at how many there were now, but I think what it was that I synchronized, literally, like synchronizing a watch before you go on a mission, with myself. And what's interesting about that is then I notice them instead of, I'll get to that. And then they go by and you just miss them. So I think this group, I'm looking forward to the confluence too, especially because most everyone in the group is like that. They are aware and they notice.
Right. And some people don't really appreciate why it's important to be present. So I think I might talk about that for a moment.
Excellent.
It used to be, people used to ask me why I went to trade shows and that sort of thing. And we'd set up a booth and we would stand in the booth. But it wasn't about that kind of advertising. It was about all the people that you would meet and have time with outside of the show. It was what was not happening
Right.
on the show floor. And here in our confluence, we are going to have some extremely experienced Jungian psychologists, actually a psychiatrist, a psychologist, who are experts in Jung. We're going to have a poet. We're going to have a couple of artists, and they all have worked with Jung. Colleen Kibert, who is going to be there, has been working on it for about 60 years. And she really knows why it's important to be together for this. And somehow we had an insight. I'm not going to claim that it was my insight, but we had an insight together that that Jungian psychology does the same thing that religion does and that art does. And so there's this quote in a book called Liberating the Heart by Lawrence Jaffe. Just lousy at beating the clock here. Why doesn't it do it?
Yeah, right. And it's right in front of your face that starts to show up. Well, there's that logos.
Lawrence Jaffe.
There's that logo. It's not getting picked up.
So Lawrence has this one sentence that summarizes it all, which is the purpose of Jung's whole psychology is to make accessible to us that healing power which resides in our unconscious. And that's what art does, and that's what religion does. And so what we realized was that it is the coming together of these threads that teaches us how to heal ourselves when we're really upset. And people think that, you're going to go to a shrink and they're going to give you a pill and everything will be hunky-dory. Well, that doesn't do it at all. And it doesn't do it to take drugs to get to that place, that healing place in the psyche. You have to go into yourself and find out what's going on. And boy, I had it today. I mean, talking about synchronicities, I'm always having them. And this afternoon, I was trying to decide whether to go over and do my blood test. I just dozed off for about 30 seconds, and boom, I had these two dreams that really told me. I think one of them presented me with a needle, an injection needle, and the other one showed me a vehicle, and it said, "Get going, man." So,
well, I love that Lawrence Jaffe quote, because to me, even when I'm asked, how tarot works, it's the same way art therapy works,
exactly.
where I'm no fortune teller. That's, to me, clairfraudulence. Some people may be, but I find simply when visual images strike chords to resonate in the imagination, it rings the bell to open the unconscious, the creative wellspring, to well up its nourishing contents. And I saw a quote a couple of weeks ago that goes with what I just said, and then Lawrence Jaffe's quote there that I just thoroughly resonated with. And I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but basically it says, to paraphrase, when humanity relearns the visual language and the ability to read symbols, the veils will lift from the eyes of humanity, basically, of people. And I find that what happens there is because a picture tells 1,000 words. So that's not just some quippy cliche. It literally is a visual story.
Yeah.
You know,
And it's
once
way
upon
more
a
than
time,
1,000.
yeah, and it's the infinite, you know, like a
Yeah.
symbol. It has infinite meanings, interpretations, and they are all based on context. So they pour in and literally have conversation with what, you know, your environment is providing also. It's a double stimulus. I think the inner and outer confluence, as it were, and how they come together to influence us.
Boy, the classic example of this is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who went to Cornell to study under Carl Sagan. And both of them are very strict logos guys. They want to write everything that's psychological out of the equation. Mm-hmm. And he told a story once on a video I saw where he told about the first time he went up to Carl Sagan's office, and there was Carl Sagan's name on the door. And he had this incredible feeling, and things were going on in his psyche and so on. And then he went in and met Sagan, of course. But his problem is that he couldn't describe, probably in 2 encyclopedias, what that instant, that numinous instant mm-hmm. meant to him. And that's the point.
Well, and I think with that being the point, I find there's such an important piece in that experience. And even if I want to say, okay, take all the psychology out of it, well, I could go straight to a biochemistry argument. And the reason to, you know, some extreme cases, I'm not going to say psychiatry should be illegal, you know, but I'm not going to go all the way there. But mm-hmm. I think that the ability for the brain to balance its own chemicals and to create these experiences, there are chemicals and cocktails of chemicals that are released in the brain at these experiences, during these experiences.
Absolutely, surely.
And so I could discount mythological, psychological, everything, and say, well, you're going to have these biochemical effects. Tell us how you feel when that happens. It's going to be the same thing, you know? And mm-hmm. so I haven't really dismissed mythology or psychology or astrology or alchemy. And at the same time, I think it goes hand in hand with physiologically. I think what Jung called it psychogenesis, or, you know, the psychogenetic affects, where it's literally a physiological, psychological phenomenon. They're happening hand in hand.
Yes, of course it is, because the psyche is a major organ of the human being, the unconscious, and the collective unconscious too. So there's the psyche, which is an organ of all of us. Mm-hmm. And just before most people came to this conversation, I was getting a pitch from my law school for money, and it turned out the woman was from Ukraine. And I go, oh my God. And they're actually from Crimea and haven't been able to go back since 2013. And I just said, wow, what a life to live that way. But
you know, one last thing, example I'll bring up. I had an interesting conversation yesterday about the legality of disclaimers in the divination professions, and people having to say for entertainment purposes only. And I said, I absolutely never put for entertainment purposes only. It demeans it. And someone said, well, what you're doing is actually real, they'll call that fortune telling. And I said, no, my given is simply that the psyche is real. And a mundane example is, if you go to a restaurant and you ask the waiter or waitress for a recommendation on the menu, they might not even read the menu. they may tell you something that's literally off the menu. And what happens is that they enhance your dinner experience.
Exactly.
And that's what, psychology, I find, and all the different, professions that feed into also do. And it's somewhat of a mundane example with a waiter or waitress, but that basis, that menu, is just simply a format starting point to then spin off of and catalyze other things. So they may recommend something that the chef cooked up that morning and, she hasn't put on the menu yet, or won't. And that to me is I think a legal precedent example. I don't think I'll ever have to use it. I don't know that people are going to come a call in that way. But I think a lot of people are really afraid of the legality because of blue laws that are still hanging around about fortune telling. And what's interesting is there are no blue laws about imagination, but people use it every day. So it's interesting to me, the strata of history and what's been precluded and what's been included.
Yeah, I never heard that term applied to fortune telling. I've heard it applied to having liquor on Sundays.
Right, or in supermarkets, right, exactly.
Selling it on Sundays. But good evening, JDS. Yeah, I mean, if ever you're feeling bad, you might, before you spend money, $150 an hour on a psychotherapist, you might want to see if you can find a tarot reader. And because they often can shake some things loose in your psyche that you had not anticipated. And
I even had last week someone who I read for in the fall called when she was back in town, and we had a wonderful long reading. And she said, "I have to tell you, my psychiatrist said I had to keep you." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "You helped me navigate some things that she was having a hard time explaining, but now that you have, she has a better handle on how to work with me." And so I think there was probably a tandem of a bit of probably a psychiatrist that may have been more scientific, and but the partner dance, to me, it was quite an honor.
Well, but psychiatrists would be that way because psychiatrists are medical doctors who dispense drugs for people that are actually mentally ill.
Right.
and so, but what John Jackson has said to me many times is that he most often gets help from poetry or from Jung or all kinds of other things. So,
and that I think that I just think that it's the biggest important thing I see now is to remove, like, for example, blue laws and such. The shaming blue laws.
What does the blue law say? Because as I said, the only ones I know of had to do with liquor.
Well, there are a lot of laws on the books that they're usually not enforced unless you make piss somebody off. Then of course they'll go, "Oh, well, here, look," which is to me hypocritical. But that they basically say no fortune telling, no supernatural indications. Some of them go so far as to say no tarot cards, but usually it's all of these fields will be required to state for entertainment purposes only. And the thing is, I'm not a carny. I don't work for the carnival.
I never was aware of that. I've never heard of such laws, but I have used disclaimers saying that I'm not a mental health professional. And everyone should know that neither Jordan or I are licensed mental health professionals. We're just people who are widely read in the field of Jungian psychology and in divination and other things. And so we're giving our audience the benefit of our experience. And if you find it meaningful, then it's meaningful, it's useful. And if you don't, then probably you won't be following this
Yeah,
for much
there's a
longer.
huge argument going and discussion going on. It's been going on for over a decade in the divination professions, and people trying to incite licensure and regulation. And I'm like, well, who's going to regulate me? Who's going to regulate any professional that's already doing this? The professionals would have to set up the regulations, and we don't have any time for that. And to me, when they're like, well, you really should use that disclaimer, I said, until I'm required to have insurance for that specifically, I need no disclaimer. I might as well be a grocery store, and you don't need a disclaimer to sell cereal,
Well,
or the milk that goes with it.
Yeah. Anyway,
So.
I have synchronicities and luminous moments every day of my life, and I am fortunate that I recognize them now. And so does everyone, but most people pretend they don't exist or pretend they have no meaning, and they certainly do have meaning. And if you try to resist them, you're going to be in trouble. That's what.
Typically, I mean, Georgia O'Keeffe was once asked, why she painted her flowers so big. And she said, well, son, everybody looks. I'm trying to get people to see.
There you go. Yeah, she was a pistol, that's for sure.
Yeah, she was.
Okay, so we're going to read through this thing, and I think there's 4 more pages or 6 more pages, 5 more pages, and we'll be done. So let's take turns.
Let's see if we can get through all this.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take the easy paragraph, 246. I probably will be in trouble. Oh, but oh my God, I'm giving you a paragraph that actually has only 1 sentence in it, and that you have to read 2 pages here, but then your next reading would be 1 sentence. So okay.
Well, no, that's great. We had an English exercise in high school. I remember who can write the longest grammatically correct sentence. And a friend of mine did. It was 2 pages long. I mean, it used colons and semicolons and commas and appositives. But at the end, she said, the only problem, son, is it makes no sense, except you did it. Nouns and verbs are all, but so yeah, this is going to be one of those anomaly paragraphs where he can go. So I'll have to play like a singer and work on my breathing.
Okay, so I'll read 246. When we analyze the persona, we strip off the mask and discover that what seemed to be individual is at bottom collective. In other words, that the persona was only a mask of the collective psyche. Fundamentally, the persona is nothing real. It is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. He takes a name, earns a title, exercises a function. He is this or that. In a certain sense, all this is real, yet in relation to the essential individuality of the person concerned, it is only a secondary reality, a compromise formation in making which others often have a greater share than he. The persona is a semblance, a 2-dimensional reality, to give it a nickname. Okay, so I have experience with this because I became a United States Marine officer at one point in my life and did it for 23 years. But when I went to officer candidate school, you're raw, you have to be in good shape, but you don't have any clue about what you're supposed to do. Although I had a leg up in the sense that I grew up in the Navy, so I knew something about the Marines, but not that much. And so I had to learn what it was really like. And Um, and so I had to start making sure that my behavior matched what I was expected to do. So when I ran into a senior officer or somebody senior to me, I would salute them and they would salute back. And when somebody who was junior to me came up to me, they would salute me and I would salute back. And so that's the custom. The junior person salutes first. And they teach you how to salute, and it's quite specific in the Marine Corps how you salute. You can't salute like this, like a Britisher, because we never reveal our armaments. And the British raise their hand like this to salute, which says, I have no weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And we give a close salute, which means that I'm not going to tell you what weapons I have. You, you mind your P's and Q's around me.
Well, that, I love the history too of, the raising the hand like this to salute. It's also the knight lifting the visor to the queen.
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly.
So I'm going to show you my face.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
And so anyway, it's a good custom, and it mainly simply says, I respect you, and I respect that you're senior to me, that you're a rank ahead of me. That's why I salute first, and then you acknowledge the respect. But okay, so anyway, but what it takes to be a Marine was developed long ago in a collective, and I had no part in establishing what it should be, and I had to conform myself to that standard, which I did and do proudly. I still maintain my commission. I'm 75 years old, but I still sometimes I wear my uniform if I do an honor salute for a veteran who's dying, and I'm very proud to do that, by the way. But
I think that Marine example is a wonderful piece of this last sentence where he says the semblance, the two-dimensional reality, to give it a nickname. I'd call it a mask. But what's interesting is I find there's two kinds of masks: the superficial mask, which is just persona, and then there is presence and personality of the substance generating the surface, the substance generating the mask, so to speak, or the substance generating the surface. And it's interesting then, because in the military, it's not developed to, it may go from outside in, but the thing is, you don't have Halloween. You're not wearing this trickery. It's serious. And I think there's a substance there, say with Marines, that the presence matches the appearance. Right. So, what's substance versus what's a mask versus what is simply the appearance. And that's the appearance is generated by the substance making the surface.
And so in the MBTI, I'm a rather unusual Marine. The typical Marine officer is STJ, which means they get all the facts, they think about them, and they make a judgment and exercise. Meanwhile, I'm NTP, so I have a feeling about the facts. In other words, I have a global view about the facts, and I think about that, and then I don't necessarily just execute right away. And what happens is about 95% of all officers are STJ, and they're people that can follow orders correctly, and they do what they're told to do. But the people that really get to the top of all the services tend to be NT, probably J mostly, in the sense that they're willing to deal with the politics. I've said a few times that Marines used to come to me and say, well, don't make me deal with the politics. Whatever you tell me to do, I'll do, but I don't want to have to deal with the politics. But the problem is that the politics are everything. And so you either know what the politics are in your unit, or you might be dead. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so anyway, I mean, these are just offhand comments, but it's all about a persona, because as I say, I'm not a picture book Marine. I'm not a huge guy per se. And, I was physically fit enough to do the work, but when I take off my uniform, I tend to chill out.
Right.
And not all retired Marine officers can chill out. They're still trying to run their household like a Marine unit, and their wives don't tend to appreciate it very much.
Right.
But what I found was that when I put my uniform on, then I'm a Marine. Okay. And it is much more than superficial. It's much more than wearing a costume. It's I become STJ in that.
It's interesting you say that, because I had the same thing with my gi and my black belt. When that went on and I'm in front of class, it was different. I mean, it was, everything was so specific and everything was aware. And honestly, I was probably happiest pee in a pod then. But when it came off, there was kind of an exhale in a way where, okay, well, I can't be that aware all the time.
Yes. Right. So anyway, you can read on with 247.
247. Okay. Paragraph 247. It would be wrong to leave the matter as it stands without at the same time recognizing that there is, after all, something individual in the peculiar choice and delineation of their persona, and that despite the exclusive identity of the ego consciousness with the persona, the unconscious self, one's real individuality is always present and makes itself felt indirectly, if not directly. Although the ego consciousness is at first identical with the persona, that compromised role in which we parade before the community, yet the unconscious self can never be repressed to the point of extinction. Its influence is chiefly manifest in the special nature of the contrasting and compensating contents of the unconscious. The purely personal attitude of the conscious mind evokes reactions on the part of the unconscious, and these, together with personal repressions, contain the seeds of individual development in the guise of collective fantasies. Through the analysis of the personal unconscious, the conscious mind becomes suffused with collective material, which brings with it the elements of individuality. I am well aware that this conclusion must be almost unintelligible to anyone not familiar with my views and technique, and particularly so to those who habitually regard the unconscious from the standpoint of Freudian theory. But if the reader will recall my example of the philosophy student, he can form a rough idea of what I mean. At the beginning of the treatment, the patient was quite unconscious of the fact that her relation to her father was a fixation, and that she was therefore seeking a man like her father, whom she could then meet with her intellect. This in itself would not have been a mistake if her intellect had not had that peculiarly protesting character, such as is unfortunately often encountered in intellectual women. Such an intellect is always trying to point out mistakes in others. It is preeminently critical with a disagreeably personal undertone, yet it always wants to be considered objective. This invariably makes a man bad-tempered, particularly if, as so often happens, the criticism touches on some weak spot which, in the interest of fruitful discussion were better avoided. But far from wishing the discussion to be fruitful, it is the unfortunate peculiarity of this feminine intellect to seek out a man's weak spots, fasten on them, and exasperate him. This is not usually a conscious aim, but rather has the unconscious purpose of forcing a man into a superior position and thus making him an object of admiration. The man does not, as a rule, notice that he is having the role of the hero thrust upon him. He merely finds her taunts so odious that in future he will go a long way to avoid meeting the lady. In the end, the only man who can stand her is the one who gives in at the start and therefore has nothing wonderful about him.
Yeah. Or in my case, I've had two wives. And my first wife wanted to perfect me in the image of her father, and that wasn't going to happen.
Right.
And I was very accepting of that for many years. We were married for 17 years, and we were together for 17 years. We were married for 20. And mostly I just, went with the flow, but eventually it just started to be drip, drip, drip on porcelain. And finally it just tore through. And then I said, she's just driving me out of the household. Now, in the case of my second marriage, everything that I say is wrong. Okay. In other words, Debbie is a very judging person. That's the one thing we're different on. And fortunately, I'm a perceiving person. So I just go, hey, okay, whatever. But thanks to Jungian psychology, I realized that this is normal. Okay. And that, if I have actually a coffee mug. There are different versions of this, but I have one from Arizona that says, if a man speaks in the desert and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the answer to that is yes, emphatically yes. And why is that true? It's true because we're only half loaf. And that's why we marry in the first place, is to get wholeness into our life and to experience wholeness so that we become whole human beings. And so when I speak and Debbie disagrees with me or gives me some better conclusion than my conclusion, fortunately, my P nature says, okay, screw it. And I often think of that coffee cup, but and it doesn't bother me anymore. And and I rolled with the punches for quite a while with my first wife, but then in the first case, myself didn't want me to do what she wanted me to do, which was to build a small law practice in a small town in upstate New York, which was never my objective in life. And so I never wanted to do that. And myself just said, wait a minute, you're not doing that, buddy.
Well, and those two examples are wonderful. I mean, the last relationship 6 years ago, was similar to your first wife. And what's interesting is there's no quantity beyond infinity that you could apply to it in the amount of shaming behavior that goes on there. But you don't realize at first that they're trying to put you in a position of leadership and charge. But it's in this case, it was because of a lack of a dad, a lack of a father. And so, that's what drove me to the brink there. But it's interesting then when you say, with Debbie, being a judger that way and you being a perceiver, there's a difference because the first one was nagging. And the second one is paying attention. They are including you in your experience. And so it's not that they're stroking you and you need all that attention, but it's that it's a way for them to dance with pushback instead of shooting you with poison darts.
Well, and we have a partnership, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, my first wife wanted me to be her father, and I didn't want to be her father for a variety of reasons, although I loved her father and still do. He was an incredible man, but he wasn't the kind of man I wanted to be. And but Debbie and I have always had a partnership, and that has been quite special. And people will, assuming that we can get Debbie to Helena, and it's a close thing because her mother is quite elderly and is trying to make noises like you really shouldn't go. But I'm hoping she'll be able to come with me to Helena this summer. And people will see that Debbie is just an amazing person. I mean, they, everybody loves Debbie, no doubt. I mean, as soon as they start to talk with her, because she has this way of speaking wisdom that it's like the story about how Dr. Jung gave a speech, and then the three psychologists come out and say, well, he was talking about my problem. And the other one says, no, he was talking about my problem. And the other one will say, he was talking about my problem. And that's the way Debbie is. She connects with everyone at a very, very deep level. And
that reminds me a bit of a great friend of mine who ended up being my thesis mate in college, and his head was screwed on tight, but fluidly. And when, he'd see one of our friends and he's like, it's not the infatuation or the youthful troubadourian love, as Joseph Campbell would call it, that you need to worry about. He goes, that's not the problem. He goes, it's when you put a woman up on a pedestal, it just makes it that much easier for her to kick your teeth right down your throat. And I'm like, he got it. We were, 22 or whatever. He already got it.
right.
But
right.
So.
But this is my advice to everyone, and that is that we are half a loaf. There's dualities in everything. And if you're attracted to someone, it's very likely because that person fills in some of your voids. And so when you speak, even if you speak in the desert, you're half run and you're missing something. And so you need to think about that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to make a distinction. I agree, and with conditions, it's not a hole in our heart. It's not that I need to be completed. What it is, I find, is it's the dynamism of not being in the cave of yourself. And the thing is, the difference between your first wife and then Debbie is when you say partnership, the thing is your partner, you are unthreatened by your partner, but you are threatened by shame and behavior that promotes triggers, tries to, find in your weak spots rather than informing you that, hey, this is something I've been noticing, where it's discussive. And I find the difference there is that, then you can be together, always complete, never finished, lifelong. And you're not trying to become whole, I find so much as, and it's a point of semantics, but it's about the partner dance where you're on the same side.
Yeah. When I think about it, I probably would have stuck with my first marriage if I knew something, if I knew then what I know now about psychology, but I didn't. We weren't properly educated. We still don't educate children properly about psychology. And the result is the only way I could change it was to leave.
Mhm.
And
Well,
I had that a numinous moment that made me recognize that.
yeah, and I think that's a great point, because the hardest part about that, even knowing something about psychology, is when you're in that, there's a dyslexic dynamic, is what I finally realized, where you don't commonsensically, consciously or unconsciously, come to realize they're attempting to put you in charge, like a sibling does the first sibling. They're trying to compete. They're trying to use you as a model to grow. And the problem is, with the degree of shaming behavior that often goes in that, there's nothing positive. So you don't notice that they're trying to make you into the hero. They're trying to make you into what they want to learn from, because you're being demeaned all the time. And so I think there's that dyslexic dynamic where I didn't notice until I was out of it. I just noticed how deflated you tend to get there. And how maddened at every, there's something called misophonia. And I remember when every time I would chew food, she would just start, getting all, and what happened is, I remember going, oh, you have some misophonia. The problem is, when I'm chewing, that means I won't die. And you rather I would. I'm eating, and as long as I'm doing that.
Oh, that's pretty bad. Okay,
yeah, it was.
I'm going to read my next long paragraph, and then you get your one sentence one.
Oh, okay. Look at that.
Paragraph 248. My patient naturally found much to reflect upon in all this, for she had no notion of the game she was playing. Moreover, she still had to gain insight into the regular romance that had been enacted between her and her father ever since childhood. It would lead us too far to describe in detail how, from her earliest years, with unconscious sympathy, she had played upon the shadow side of her father, which her mother never saw, and how far in advance of her years she became her mother's rival. All this came to light in the analysis of the personal unconscious. Since, if only for professional reasons, I could not allow myself to be irritated, I inevitably became the hero and father lover. The transference, too, consisted at first of content from the personal unconscious. My role as a hero was just a sham, and so, as it turned me into the merest phantom, she was able to play her traditional role of the supremely wise, very grown-up, all-understanding mother-daughter beloved, an empty role, a persona behind which her real and authentic being, her individual self, lay hidden. Indeed, to the extent that she at first completely identified herself with her role, she was altogether unconscious of her real self. She was still in her nebulous infantile world and had not yet discovered the real world at all. But as through progressive analysis, she became conscious of the nature of her transference, the dreams I spoke of in chapter 1 began to materialize. They brought up bits of the collective unconscious, and that was the end of her infantile world and of all the heroics. She came to herself and to her own real potentialities. This is roughly the way things go in most cases. If the analysis is carried far enough that the consciousness of her individuality should coincide exactly with the reactivation of an archaic God image, is not just an isolated coincidence, but a very frequent occurrence, which, in my view, corresponds to an unconscious law. Okay. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I think the one thing that really that I think is a good lesson for everyone on the planet, when in the middle of that first portion of the paragraph on page 159, paragraph 248, since, if only for professional reasons, I could not allow myself to be irritated. That's a lesson, I think, because I wrote down then, this begins to train someone how to listen with engagement while being unthreatened and untriggered. And I think it's in a sense, that's Jung providing a nice piece of psychological coaching advice.
Yeah, this is only the wounded doctor can heal, because he's seen it before, right? And it was painful for him.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because I'm working on an article. It's like Chiron, the wounded healer, and the title is "Wounded Healer" is a redundant title, because you can't be a healer if you're not wounded. I mean, we're all wounded, but I think that unthreatened and untriggered allows you, if you detect yourself getting irritated, to listen deeply as your natural mode, rather than to jump and lash out to participate in the alleged heroics that are really just a melee.
Right. Well, okay, I have some experience with this because of my sister. My sister was in the 8th grade when I left for college, and she had gone to school, junior high school, and the late years of elementary school in Japan. And when finally my parents came home from Japan, they went to live in a very rural part of Ohio. And this was a town that had more pigs than people. Okay. And it was ideal for my parents because there was a man-made lake there, and they were able to buy inexpensively a home on the lake, which had been a dream of theirs for most of their career in the Navy, to retire and have a home on the lake. And so for them, it was wonderful. But for my sister, she was going to a school that you couldn't see through the cornfields. It was, and the kids that were going to that school, and my brother was there as well, had never been out of the county. So they had no sophistication about the world at all, no consciousness about anything beyond the farm, right? Where, and what's going on a pig farm, right? And here was my sister who had, been doing all this thing in a very sophisticated way in Japan, learning about different cultures and all that sort of stuff. And she comes back to the school and she was terribly unhappy. And then my father retired from the Navy and took a job at another small town in central Michigan. And once again, there were very few people around. And she went to this sort of parochial high school. By parochial, I don't mean Catholic. It was a public school, but it was very rural. And she got gigged for skirt length one day. And she was furious about it. I mean, this is, God, when is this? This was back in 1968. And she went home and she put on a full-length evening gown and came back to school. And she was immediately suspended for sass by the
Good for her, though.
principal, right? And so she was pissed. I mean, she was spitting nails. And so she only needed one credit, high school credit, to graduate. And so she conned my father. She was finishing her junior year, but she only needed one credit to graduate. So she conned my father into letting her take typing over the summer. And then she would get her diploma. And then she wanted my father to send her to a professional writing academy in London, in England, not in London, but in England. And just as that was happening, and my father butt in on all of that, just as that was happening was also a very dramatic summer in the collective, which was the riots at the Democratic Convention in 1968 and the brutality of the Chicago police force and so on. And she just blew a gasket. And my father took her up to her flight and let her get on the flight. The school met her on the other end, and she wasn't on the flight. And so what had happened was she had met this Cockney bum on the plane. And he said, well, don't go to that school. Come and live in Soho with me in London. Well, she disappeared entirely for a month. And I won't go through all of her trials and tribulations, but she blew through. She was very opinionated, of course, as you might guess. And she blew through 3 husbands, one of whom was this Cockney bum. There's lots of great stories around this, but I'm not going to go into it. But she ended up, for the last 26 years of my father's life, 29 years of my mother's life, living with them again. And as a single woman, and her 3 marriages have fallen apart. And exactly what Dr. Jung is talking about here happened, which was that she displaced my mother. And my mother never forgave her for that.
Right.
Because she was, my father's princess, and my father just adored her and, let her do whatever she wanted. And, that wasn't good in a number of ways. And my mother just was furious that she'd been supplanted by her own daughter. But it does happen.
And
So,
that actually is I'm glad you went at length in that, because that's such a wonderful example of that Oedipal piece of to kill the mother, to kill the father, for the daughter to kill the mother, for the son to kill the father. It's not murder. It's a metaphor and an analogy for taking their title, for moving into their position. So in a sense, it's in an offhand way, it's saying I'm molting into my higher purpose. But the problem is it goes oftentimes, unfortunately, through the parent, and that's the compensatory, because they're still not looking outside the home, which is the Oedipal piece. It's not the sexual relations with a parent. It's the fact that you didn't leave the nest.
Well, she definitely did leave the nest, but let's see. One marriage lasted 10 months. One lasted 5 years, and one lasted about 7 or 8 years, but that was it. The rest of the time she went home. And so you could say it's a kind of failure to launch.
Yeah, using your parent as a model is wonderful when you launch, but if you don't launch, you create a toxic situation, and that bickering, and then you pit one parent against another without doing it consciously. You think you're just trying to grow, but you also don't realize how much you're trying to be in control when you're trying to be in control in someone else's position. And so there's a quasi-betrayal that occurs within a family when that happens.
And it's unconscious.
Right, completely.
Except for my mother, it was very conscious with her.
Conscious of it, right.
Yeah, my mother was very conscious because she was displaced, but my father just thought everything was hunky-dory, and my sister did too.
Yeah.
So anyway, actually, I'm not going to let you get away with it because it's just a transition.
I know.
Paragraph.
I just noticed that.
So
I'll read that and the next paragraph.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, and I looked down and went, oh, that's just, he should have just put colon, just did 2 dots.
Right.
After this digression, let us turn back to our earlier reflections. And I would like all the listeners to know that's the shortest sentence ever in a Jungian text. So, and the shortest paragraph ever in a Jungian text.
Yeah, I never have seen one that short, as a matter of fact.
And it's even a short sentence for him. So, so paragraph 250. Once the personal repressions are lifted, the individuality and the collective psyche begin to emerge in a coalescent state, thus releasing the hitherto repressed personal fantasies. The fantasies and dreams, which now appear, assume a somewhat different aspect. An infallible sign of collective images seems to be the appearance of the, in quotes, cosmic element, i.e., in essence, the images in the dream or fantasy are connected with cosmic qualities, such as temporal and spatial infinity, enormous speed and an extension of movement, in quotes, astrological associations, telluric, lunar, and solar analogies, changes in the proportions of the body, etc. The obvious occurrence of mythological and religious motifs in a dream also points to the activity of the collective unconscious. The collective element is very often announced by peculiar symptoms, as for example, by dreams where the dreamer is flying through space like a comet, or feels that they are the earth or the sun or a star, or is of immense size or dwarfishly small, or that they are dead, are in a strange place, are strangers to themselves, confused, mad. Similarly, feelings of disorientation, of dizziness, and the like may appear along with symptoms of inflation. And when he mentions the peculiar symptoms, he puts footnote 2, which I think is worth reading here. Footnote 2, it may not be superfluous to note that collective elements in dreams are not restricted to this stage of analytical treatment. There are many psychological situations in which the activity of the collective unconscious can come to the surface, but this is not the place to enlarge upon these conditions.
Right. And, as I was speaking to this one woman who's Ukrainian American this evening, right before we began, or as we began, I'm sure that she and her family are probably having a lot of dreams about what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Right.
And so let's just keep going. 251. Go ahead. Yeah. Did you have more to say about
I'll
this?
go ahead and read it. You may go ahead and read 251, or you want to?
I'll do 251.
Okay.
252. Okay, so 251. The forces that burst out of the collective psyche have a confusing and blinding effect. One result is the dissolution of the persona is a release. One result of the dissolution of the persona is a release of involuntary fantasy, which is apparently nothing else than the specific activity of the collective psyche. This activity throws up contents whose existence one had never suspected before. But as the influence of the collective unconscious increases, so the conscious mind loses its power of leadership. Imperceptibly, it becomes the lead, while an unconscious and impersonal process gradually takes control. Thus, without noticing it, the conscious personality is pushed about like a figure on a chessboard by an invisible player. It is this player who decides the game of fate, not the conscious mind and its plans. This is how the resolution of the transference, apparently so impossible to the conscious mind, was brought about in my earlier example. You want to take something?
Yeah, and I'll keep going because these are continuing together. Paragraph 252. The plunge into this process becomes unavoidable whenever the necessity arises of overcoming an apparently insuperable difficulty. It goes without saying that this necessity does not occur in every case of neurosis, since perhaps in the majority, the prime consideration is only the removal of temporary difficulties of adaptation. Certainly, severe cases cannot be cured without a far-reaching change of character or of attitude. In by far the greater number, adaptation to external reality demands so much work that inner adaptation up to the collective unconscious cannot be considered for a very long time. But when this inner adaptation becomes a problem, a strange, irresistible attraction proceeds from the unconscious and exerts a powerful influence on the conscious direction of life. The predominance of unconscious influences, together with associated disintegration of the persona and the deposition of the conscious mind from power, a deposition of the conscious mind from power, constitute a state of psychic disequilibrium, which in analytical treatment is artificially induced for the therapeutic purpose of resolving a difficulty that might block further development. There are, of course, innumerable obstacles that can be overcome with good advice and a little moral support, aided by goodwill and understanding on the part of the patient. Excellent curative results can be obtained in this way. Cases are not uncommon where there is no need to breathe a word about the unconscious. But again, there are difficulties for which one can foresee no satisfactory solution. If in these cases the psychic equilibrium is not already disturbed before treatment begins, it will certainly be upset during the analysis, and sometimes without any interference by the doctor. It often seems as though these patients had only been waiting to find a trustworthy person in order to give up and collapse. Such a loss of balance is similar in principle to a psychotic disturbance. That is, it differs from the initial stages of mental illness only by the fact that it leads in the end to greater health, while the latter, being the psychotic, leads to greater destruction. It is a condition of panic, a letting go in face of apparently hopeless complications. Mostly, it was preceded by desperate efforts to master the difficulty by force of will. Then came the collapse, and all the once guiding will crumbles completely. The energy thus freed disappears from the unconscious and falls from the consciousness and falls into the unconscious. As a matter of fact, it is at these moments that the first signs of unconscious activity appear. And in parentheses, I'm thinking of the example of that young man who was weak in the head, close parentheses. Obviously, the energy that fell away from consciousness has activated the unconscious. The immediate result is a change of attitude. One can easily imagine that a stronger head would have taken that vision of the stars as a healing apparition and would have looked upon human suffering sub specie aeternitatis, in which case his senses would have been restored. And it's all in another.
It's all in French.
Yeah, it's all in French. So basically,
just leave it that.
Yeah, I'll just leave that one there.
Okay, so I'll just read to the end here, and then we can talk.
And actually, real quick, I think just to kind of give a pen of detail on, have looked upon human suffering sub specie aeternitatis. That would mean something that's in the underbelly that's eternal to all, rather than something that they're going through specifically, so that they, in a sense, can generalize and that strong will can keep going. So yeah, just that.
Right. Okay, so paragraph 253. Had this happened, an apparently insurmountable obstacle would have been removed. Hence, I regard the loss of balance as purposive, since it replaces a defective consciousness by the automatic and instinctive activity of the unconscious, which is aiming all the time at the creation of a new balance. and will moreover achieve this aim provided that the conscious mind is capable of assimilating the contents produced by the unconscious, i.e., of understanding and digesting them. If the unconscious simply rides roughshod over the conscious mind, a psychotic condition develops. If it can neither completely prevail nor yet be understood, the result is a conflict that cripples all further advance. But with this question, namely the understanding of the collective unconscious, we come to a formidable difficulty, which I have made the theme of my next chapter. Okay, so there's a few things I want to talk about in connection with these paragraphs, but go ahead.
Oh, so yeah, mine is just really small here, and it goes back to your Jaffe quote, where then when he's saying, it falls off the conscious into the unconscious, there's the E equals MC squared, the balance. The volume is always the same between the two. And I wrote down in the margin, balance of conscious by dropping in, literally displacing unconscious levels to well up and provide their contents to nourish the psyche. So in a sense, the ballast dropping off the conscious boat, rising tides raise all ships. The big rock goes into the ocean gets a little bit taller.
Yeah, well,
because it displaces the volume.
Sure. So the point is that if you have an attitude that's just wrong and it's giving you all sorts of problems one way or another, if somehow someone can clear aside that attitude, then the unconscious will provide the healing power,
Right.
and it will allow for healing. And that's a natural function of the psyche. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit is the distinction between neurosis and psychosis here, because neurosis, which is very often the purview of the psychologist, is really about duality, and it's about a failure to adapt to the world because you have a cockeyed opinion about something, a cockeyed attitude about something. And mind you, there are thousands of these things in all of our psyches. So everything that we face in life, we get energy from by the duality. Okay, that's where psychic energy comes from, and it comes from thousands of dualities. But if some of these dualities, like the conflict between the wife and the mistress, for example, and what's right, is it right to have a mistress or not? And those kinds of conflicts are very difficult for people. Obviously, society has its own opinion about these things, and I'm sure Dr. Jung would not state an opinion, or probably not state an opinion. He lived in a menage a trois for 40 years, and he wasn't shy about having love affairs. But he existed at a time before ethics were introduced into the psychological profession. So that came later, probably in large part because of him. But there
you go. That's
right.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the neuroses being something that is prevalent with most everyone. We all have them. It's just when they're interfering with our life. But I like, and where they're the problem. But I like that his example here, where at the point they come in, the doctor needs to say nothing at all, and they collapse. And it reminds me of someone who's either in the desert and just using every last ounce of themselves to get back to civilization, or on a mountain, or a better example might be in a boat. and they're bailing and they're bailing and they're bailing and they're getting closer to shore, and they finally get there and they fall. Because the neurosis was really an adaptation that's a defense mechanism to avoid the problem, for example, there of sinking. But it's only temporary, like a Band-Aid. And like when he says they then collapse, because they don't have to use that false fantasy, superficial technique to adapt anymore, the need for it leaves.
Right.
Whereas the psychotic, it stays and gets worse and is destructive.
Right. And there are great examples of this in the movie A Dangerous Method. And if you haven't seen this movie, I urge you to see it. It's about Dr. Jung's life when he was with Freud before the breakup. Only at the end does he break up with Freud. And it involves a love affair that he had during that period. And there's some good examples of these kinds of neuroses. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is per se true in this movie, because there's a lot of criticism about how the movie maker presented this story. And so I don't want to give the impression that I think the story is absolutely true as presented. It's not. I'm quite sure it's not. But on the other hand, there are certainly elements of truth in it. And we address part of that in our play that I'll be playing Dr. Jung this summer. So I have some personal experience with this in terms of his life, and in terms of my own life too, but that's not for discussion here. And so there is this duality, and Dr. Jung expresses it exactly in this movie, where his lover Sabina Spielrein comes to visit his home, and Emma Jung, his wife, is there with their 5 children, and actually at this point in the movie, the love affair with Sabina Spielrein has been over for a period of time. I'm not clear how long. And Sabina asks him, how do you make this work? Because she's talking to him about another woman who is Toni Wolff, who we did have a menage a trois with for 40 years. And she says, how do you make this work? And he says, well, for me, Emma is the foundation of my home, and the mother of my children, and the foundation of my life. And Toni Wolff is like the perfume in the air. And what actually happened to him during his Red Book period, then, which followed this particular period of his life, was that he was doing these self-experimentation, artificial or active imaginations with himself during the Red Book period. And he had no guidance because nobody had lived his life yet. And,
right.
And so he had to get through this period when he was having these intense visions and active imaginations and dreams and so on. And there were things in it that he just couldn't share with Emma because their domestic life required him to be another person. And so he was able to share them with Toni Wolff for this, especially for this period of 5 or 6 years when he was having these intense visions. and they worked through it together. And so Emma Jung was asked later on in her life about Tony, and she said she didn't say anything about the menage a trois per se, but she said, I'm very grateful to Tony for getting him through this intense kind of neurotic break that he was having, and a traumatic break because he had just broken with Freud and his life was sort of falling apart. And Tony was able to get him through when Emma didn't have the skills or the interest really to help him with it. And so he needed that, and Tony became a shrink in effect.
And what's interesting is, to me, there is actually a respectful point of infidelity in that menage a trois, in that with what he was going through, I wonder if Emma would have been able to see it as nothing other than his very fidelity in life crumbling. Because the intensity of the breaks and the repairs and the journey that he was going through were nuclear level explosive. And
Right.
I think that for Toni Wolff, who's in a psychological or psychiatric professional also, she's listening simply to what he's going through. And that's what's happening. She doesn't have to take it as, oh, this is too intense or you shouldn't do that. She's able to look at it and go, well, this is simply what is. Whereas Emma might then, and this is of course, conjecture, but she might then think the whole house is coming down.
Yeah.
And not understand that he's actually doing one of the most courageous things there is engage in that kind of intensity of process without dissolution, without dissolving.
Yeah. And because he was an incredibly intelligent man with huge intuition and huge insight, how do you hold on to a horse like that?
Right.
Emma was sort of this princess of the third richest man in Switzerland, who founded the IWC watch company, among other things. And she had been through quite bad trauma because her father had syphilis and was dying of syphilis. And so Dr. Jung got to know her. He was somewhat older than she was. He got to know her because he was going to treat her father confidentially. And so he was this massive intellect as compared to her. In fact, I don't even know whether she had a formal education beyond high school.
I hadn't thought about this till now, but then he's then stepping in as her father. He's stepping in as that hero, so to speak. And as her father is dying, he is becoming the replacement in a way for that figure.
Well, also, Dr. Jung wrote an article about marriage called On Marriage. And in that article, which you can find on the internet, he said that one of the partners has to be the container of the marriage, has to make it possible. And in my experience, that role swaps back and forth. But what happened to me was that I got more and more education. And during the time that I was in law school, my wife was basically putting me through law school. I mean, I had the GI Bill, but she was paying for our living expenses. And so my GI Bill was covering the cost of law school. And so she was the container at that time, and I was a student that was, living. My life was taken care of because of my wife, and I was just doing my thing as a law student. And so she was the container. But the problem was that I had already had very broad experience living in Japan, serving in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and she hadn't had those experiences. She had lived at home while I was in Vietnam. And then, I went to law school, I went to business school, and I became the container of the marriage, but she got lost in that container. And she made this statement, it turned out to be quite prophetic at one point: "You're a really big person, Skip." And she didn't mean that I was so brilliant or anything. She just meant that her psyche was just rattling around in my psyche, and she couldn't keep up with it.
And you're expansive, even just from traveling. That's inducing a breadth of experience that's just intense by its very nature.
Right. And of course, most of my international business and travel, well, my first wife did go to Japan with me for 5 years, but she never took to it. She never liked it. And for me, it was what I had always dreamed of doing. So for that 5-year period, it was wonderful for me, and it was tolerable barely for her. But then she wanted to go back and have the little law practice back in the hometown, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, and so here I am, I'm this international executive that traveled around the world 15 times in that 5-year period. And she didn't have a part of that. And so, she went back and forth for home leave and so on. But, I had done things literally all over the world. And so my perspective on the world was much larger than hers. And so Toni Wolff had a very large perspective because she had this tremendous education that her father had given her. And so she was able to keep up with Jung, but Emma, I'm sure at that stage in their lives, couldn't keep up. And so she tolerated Toni, and so she never criticized Toni for the menage a trois, but she criticized her for by light praise, by saying, well, she's glad Toni was there to get him through this intense period that he was in, which some could call a psychic break. But the point I wanted to make about neurosis is that in the end, Jung says that a neurosis is never cured. Okay, there's no healing. That what you learn to do is to put a fence around it in your psyche and put it off in a corner. And so when it comes up again, you can say, oh yeah, I remember that neurosis, and I'm going to stay away from that one, right? I'm not going to.
Yeah, and I think also, rather than healing too, the neuroses, because it's adaptable, it's an adaptation. It's I hate to put it this way, but throwing your oxygen bottle off on that one poor place on Mount Everest, the trash park is, it's sometimes it's a wasteland of trash, but you will never remember or heal from that oxygen bottle. It was an adaptation. So in a sense, you're shedding these things, and you can, in a sense, by putting the fence around them, you're burying them. So you don't go digging your dead to resurrect them. You don't need them anymore, and they're gone. And so you, in a sense,
it's a kind of pollution like that. I mean,
and I think
Mount Fuji.
Yeah, and I just got the image of a cone zone, rather than a fence around that neuroses. It's like, oh, will always be a pothole, so just go around it. It's just,
Yep,
it's a feature now.
Yeah, it's a feature. Right. And so if you learn to deal with it in that way,
right,
then you can learn to adapt with it as, a feature, as you correctly put it, as a whole that you have to go around to avoid.
Yeah. And so, I mean,
problems.
Instead of a point of interest, it's a point of disinterest. You don't need to stop and look at it anymore.
Right. And you may even not even consciously think about it anymore. Now, the difference between that, which is curable, and psychosis is that psychosis is a chemical imbalance, as I understand it, that is not curable in that way.
Right. And I think your neurosis example is apt, because in that sense, you don't need to look at it anymore. And so there's a difference between avoidance, which that's that's just putting something to bed, that's burying something, putting it back on the shelf. You don't need that anymore.
Right.
And avoidance is when you do that, but then that's when you create the psychological clutter and you self-create a problem, because then you have just a bunch of impediments and you're trying to like push yourself away. But you're right, with psychosis, that it's more medical.
You can keep making the same mistake with a neurosis, and many men do. People who abuse drugs do, where they'll go through detox, and then something will happen, and they'll take a drink, and then they're right back in it, and then they have to go through detox again, and there's multiple hits until somebody who understands psychology can give you enough information so that you can avoid it, or in the case of 12-step programs, you have people supporting you in whatever kind of 12-step issue that you're into. And those are neuroses, but you learn your way around them.
And I think they're learning to balance, again, going back to that example he had of you're dumping some conscious content, some expectations, some adaptive tools that are self-destructive, to have them be filled with something that's more nourishing. And that I think that's then when the healing occurs, is when it's almost like digging a hole underwater. It's immediately filled with more water, but that's probably a bad example, because that's a way to drown. But I think that the displacement piece of when you remove a weed from a garden, you can put more nourishing topsoil that's fertile in instead. And so you're taking the weeds. I think that's a better example. Take the weeds out and put the nourishing soil back in.
Yeah. And boy, have I had a couple of experiences with alcoholics, but I don't think I want to go into that. My grandfather was an alcoholic, and it wasn't pretty. And he basically killed his health and died. He had a stroke at age 57 and was basically incapacitated for 10 years. He finally died at age 68, which happened to be on the weekend that I got married the first time. So nobody came to my first wedding from my side except my father, mother, and brother, and my sister was off in London on her.
Well, and that's the kind of that timing that is destructive of that whole condition. I mean, it never fails. It's like this deathly cry for attention, and to then upset a wedding. You can look at it as synchronicity or chance, but it's often not. I mean, it's so.
you know, and JDS says, very personal sharing, appreciated, and validates and clarifies my life experience and understand more of Jung's humanity, which is, very clear, which, here's what happened when I told my first wife that I wanted a divorce. She insisted that we go to marriage counseling. And by the time we had gotten there, as I said, the porcelain had worn away, and it was way too late for that. But my mother expected that the psychologist would order me to go back into the marriage. Okay, that's what she was expecting, and that's what she tried to do with me. And this is my mother dealing with me. And, at the time I was, I don't know, 40 or something. And I said, Mom, you're out of line. This is my life, and you can't say those things to me.
Way past being able to be put over the knee.
Right. Right. And she shut up. She got it right away. I'm not sure my first wife ever got it, but the point was that the psychologist, and probably because of Jung's humanity in the early part of the century, was never going to tell me to go back into the marriage. I asked him one time, I said, where's this going? He kept asking us questions, and I finally asked him, where's this going? I was getting very frustrated with the questions because he wasn't telling us anything. And so I said, where's this going? And he said, I don't know. And I said, okay, well, that's enough of psychoanalysis. Then we're done with marriage counseling.
Well, I guess I had an easier time because in that relationship I was speaking about earlier, when it got to the point where enough is enough, I said, look, it's couples counseling or you're out. Mm-hmm. I'm not taking the generational thing where, the man has to leave. And I said, there's not going to be any sexism here. It's couples counseling or you're out. And it was interesting because it was okay, you pay, Jordan, and you choose. Well, I had heard about brain spotting, but that wasn't going to be this. But I found someone who did both, and we sat on that couch, and he asked me some questions to get to know me, and then he started asking her questions, and she starts, pushing it over. That's him. That's blah blah. And doing that, and he said, you need to act like he's not in the room. Maybe we need him to go out in the lobby for a second. But the thing is, she was also a psychologist. So the shaming behavior was expert level. I mean, I was beyond my depths. I think I learned more about psychology from how that whole thing played through. But it was not more than 15 minutes till he had her cornered. She wouldn't answer the question, and she bolted up and left. Mm-hmm. Well, so that happened in 10 to 15 minutes into the second session. And on the third session, I fabricated a meeting on the other side of town. So we had to arrive in different cars. And so when she bolted up after 10 minutes and left, he's like, well, don't you need to follow her? I said, that ship just sailed. I made sure we're in different cars. So I hear you do brain spotting. And he's like, well, yeah. I said, well, tell me about it. So he gives me the 3 or 4 minutes spiel. And I said, well, we've got an hour and 10 minutes left in this session. Shall we? So, that was,
interesting.
That's the way that plays.
So just in case says, my older brother did the same thing. Alcohol totally destroyed his health. And he finally died at 56 of age, 56 years of age in 2015. I'm sorry to hear that, Justin.
My condolences.
One time when I was dealing with one alcoholic that I had to deal with who was not part of my family. I was fortunate. I was in Japan, and about a week before, I'd read an article in the Wall Street Journal about how you deal with an alcoholic and what you should do, which turned out to be very good advice. But at some point, I was talking with, I think it was the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. And I was asking his advice about how to deal with this in my company, because he was an older man and very experienced, and I wanted to get a little advice, and I didn't have any psychologists around who were American style psychologists. And I said, what happens to these people if they don't get help or get on to Alcoholics Anonymous? And he says they die.
Mm-hmm.
They just die. And
riddling the body.
Right. And so this fellow, who was he had a very, very responsible position. He was a banker of sorts, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but he was running around the world signing billion-dollar loans. And what they said, what this Wall Street Journal article said, is that you can't deal with an alcoholic based on their family. They won't do anything about that. But they have to be threatened with their job, that they'll lose their job.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had this guy who was on a real bender, and his job was outside of Japan, but it was still overseas. And I told him he could go back, but if he had to get to Alcoholics Anonymous, which he said he would do, and he had to call me every week at a specific time, which he did for about 8 months. And if he didn't do that, then I would turn him into his boss. And so he was good about it for 8 months or so. And he did, dry out that time. But then about 18 months later, he blew through Tokyo again on another bender. And I walked into his room just as he was calling. His boss was calling. And his boss was calling, and he was totally out of it. He couldn't respond to the call, but I answered the call, and I knew who his boss was. So I said, well, I want you to understand that the issue seems to be alcoholism, and I want to know if your health insurance will take him to a formal detox center and get him dried out. And so this guy was very good. His boss was very good. Looked into the health insurance, and sure enough, they did have a plan within their health insurance. And so we sent him back to the U.S. for detox for 30 days. And then things went quite well for that guy after that, after the 2 benders that he had been on in Tokyo, where I literally saved his life twice. And he went back to his job, and he went to AA, and then he retired, and he married a woman that worked for me, which is how I got involved with that in the first place. And and they went and lived happily ever after for about a decade. Um, and then he did die. He died in his late 60s, I think. So again, like my grandfather, is a guy who had destroyed his liver, and you just don't live long if you do that stuff to yourself.
Yeah, it's slow. I mean,
Yeah.
it's slow and
Subtle.
and subtle, and so they can rationalize. Even they can make their own adaptive neuroses to hide. But the thing is, they're hiding it more from themselves, and they write off health problems, and they don't turn around and correct.
Yeah, in fairness, he came back to his job and then married this woman, and they had a good life for about 10 years. So I'm very pleased about that.
Nice.
But,
well, that's a nice turnabout, because in terms of hearing the stories, because usually it's the other way, and that he at least got a decade, of living rather than running.
Yeah, you just it's very hard to. Miss Delgemme says suicide in the installment plan. Yep.
That's I'm laughing, but that's one of the best ways I've ever heard it put.
Yeah, that's to the point.
Well, and I've heard someone say, be careful. Sorrows are the strongest swimmers. They'll be down at the bottom of that bottle every time, just laughing at you to open another one. And the fact is just that sorrows are the best swimmers. I think that goes well with suicide on the installment plan. That, Michelle, that's got to be the funniest but best way I think I've ever heard that put.
Yeah. So I guess based on this is life experience and not any medical or professional experience, but let me just say that if you have someone that's addicted to anything, you have to get them detoxed and into a 12-step program that they stick in for the rest of their lives.
Right.
That's the only way to do it. And they won't do it because they're afraid of they won't do it because they're afraid their wife will be mad at them. They only do it if they think they're going to lose their job. And
that goes back to your vessel, because their vessel's leaky. They're basically trying to fill a closed heart or other, and you can't. You need, things need to be a little more opened up, but opened up not by being leaky.
Yeah, and I've never been tempted in that way, but there are 5 people in my personal acquaintance and knowledge who have died because of overdoses, mostly from fentanyl. And I was not close enough to these people to be involved in whether they lived or died, but that's why on this channel we never recommend trying anything that involves pharmaceutical substances, let's say.
Well, yeah, I have to say, even with my knee surgery, my ACL replacement back in 2001, they had this Camelback thing over my knee, which had connected to a cooler, and it ran cold water while I was sleeping over the knee, so you don't get swelling. Well, the charge nurse didn't realize it wasn't the one with the compressor in it. It was the older one that you had to every hour put another 2 bags of ice in, because your body's melting it. Right. Well, so I woke up in that next morning with 104-degree water flowing over my knee, and I was I was screaming. And here they come with this little bitty 50, cc's of morphine, boom. And then I'm like, oh, I don't care. But because they had let it go so long. But I'm kind of thankful for that, because when I got home, there was like a 2-week supply of OxyContin
Mhm.
or oxycodone, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's basically just morphine in a pill form.
Yeah.
But I remember after the second dose, like 6 hours in, it felt the same as the morphine they had popped me with. And immediately I just had this, wow, this is dirty. And
Mhm.
I think took 3 days, and at every dose I spread it 2 times longer. And I
Mhm.
would be hyper aware 30 to 40 minutes before. So if I needed to change that and take it, because it takes 20, 30 minutes to take effect.
Yeah.
And so unless I want to be screaming, but I got off of it in 3.5 days.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, because I'm glad I did, because then it did what it was supposed to. I have a 6-inch gash in my knee because they harvested 1/3 of the patella tendon to
Mhm.
turn into an ACL. But after that pain, it was just deep breathing, because
Yeah.
that stuff, that was way before all the publicity. And now
Yeah.
I look back and go, oh, I'm glad I had that one hit of morphine, because then I equated the two and went, no, this can't happen.
Right. Right.
It's got to stop as
Well,
quickly as
yeah.
can.
In my case, what I found was that I did not need oxycodone.
Mm.
I've had both shoulders rehung. I've had a hip, a knee, and an ankle replaced. So I have 3 joint replacements in my legs, and um, in every one of those cases, I never took more than one of the oxycodone, and
Mm-hmm.
then I just went to Tylenol,
Mm-hmm.
and that was enough.
Yeah.
Tylenol, or well, they don't let you take ibuprofen right after a surgery, but Tylenol, just taking a couple of Tylenol was enough. So I didn't need to go to those other drugs, and so I just have made it a policy that I just will not take those things for long at all. I think the only time I did was when I had a surgery where they removed the back of my throat because of my allergy problems, and that was a difficult surgery to recover from, and it took about a week, and it was quite painful. I don't think that they even do that surgery anymore.
Mm.
It's called UPPP, and
Mm.
they just remove the back of your throat. I go, oh, you did what?
Wow.
And then
Well,
they threw me out of the hospital.
I wonder, you and I having similar experiences there. I've kind of wondered this. I haven't had anyone to corroborate it with, and it may be just a crack, layman's opinion, because I'm no doctor. But I wonder if the short stint, as it were, of taking those, I can say OxyContin, trains the body that there's this big pain here, and it takes the getting blindsided out of it, so that your pain regulation actually kicks in, and in a sense your body will self morphine in a way. I'm not sure if that occurs, but and even in that short span of time, but I just know that I didn't ever have a crisis. I mean,
Right.
I never had that 30 minutes where I wish I wasn't doing this.
Well, and what I've found since I've been studying Jung is there's enough wild and woolly psychological stuff going on just with Jung that I don't need any drugs to get there.
Yeah, I can distract myself with that. Yeah, that's.
Let's see. There we have a couple of comments here. So JDS says, in marriage counseling, each was asked the other, what would it take to make the marriage work? And the former spouse said, go to my family with me. They already owned everybody's birthday and holiday. Okay, well, that can be very painful, and I can relate to that. I can't even stand my own sister anymore, let alone. So, and she can't stand me either. So that's what's fair is fair. But people tend to have issues within families, and anyway, so
well, that's interesting. That's an interesting comment though too, because one of the things I've noticed with couples who survive those huge rifts are that they both realize that they don't need to continue to make their partner into some component that's, they are trying to substitute into their family. They actually start to, like you said, they get over the honeymoon period and now, oh, this is who I'm with. They begin to actually see the person for who they are, rather than for the trauma triggers and trauma bonds that they're trying to replace.
Yeah. And I shouldn't say anything about my ex-wife's family, because when you have a divorce and you already have 3 children, you're gonna run into them every time there's a marriage or a death in the family, or whatever, and so you never escape them. Typically, it's hard to get away from them.
Right.
Justin, let's see. Estelle says, I think it depends on your Pisces placements. I guess that is what experience you possibly have with any drug. Yeah, I'm sure that there's something to that.
And Neptune would go along with that as well.
Right. And Justin says, to me, drinking a glass of water can work as a drug if I want to. Actually, I don't even need water. Okay, well, good for you, Justin. I'm drinking water all the time, constantly. I always have a glass of water in front of me.
I actually, in college, through all the all-nighters, people taking no-dose and drinking coffee, I would just drink water. And it may not have started the process as quickly as coffee, but that meant every 15, 20 minutes, I was up and going to the bathroom. Mm-hmm. And so just the physical activity amidst, I was able to stay up, but I laughed at people, how are you staying up for 3 days in a row? A lot of water, a lot of urinal. It's like...
Now my watch is telling me it's time to stand, it says. So
yeah.
So we've reached our
golden
hour here, our golden hour. And so thank you all for being here with us tonight. And next week, and Michelle says, perfect Neptune Jupiter conjunct statement.
That's there you go.
Okay, so next week we're going to start part 4 of this particular essay, which is called Negative Attempts to Free the Individuality from the Collective Psyche. And the first part of it is called Regressive Restoration of the Persona. So that should be a barrel of monkeys.
Yeah, we know how to have fun here.
But by all means, if you go up to the top of this chat, you'll find how to become a member of our panel. If you'd like to talk with us, you're welcome to it. And I guess I could put it on one more time, perhaps. All right, so here's the MailChimp sign up. I'm going to give it to you on the chat here. So go to that sign up and tell us you want to come to the Monday night meeting or whatever meeting you'd like, and we'll enjoy having someone else to talk to.
Yeah, definitely.
And then also don't forget, we're running out of time on our bed and breakfast for the Confluence. So if you haven't reserved your space
Mhm.
for the bed and breakfast. Did you do that already, Jordan?
I'm doing that on Wednesday. I'm getting everything taken care of. So I'm getting back on the plaza. The business licenses list by list by list. So I just focused on that. So on Wednesday, I've got that. Okay, do that before I go to work. So
Yeah. So
before this week gets out.
So I'm putting the link for the Confluence up again. And so please do register and get us to set up your bed and breakfast, because it's you save quite a bit of money by doing that rather than trying to stay in a hotel in a place near Yellowstone in the summertime.
Yeah, Tim got some really good deals there. One quick clarifying question. The Yellowstone trip, is the price on the Confluence website including the Confluence or an additional? I think it was 500 and something.
Yeah, it's an additional price for the
but an additional like 565 from the original four. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's
basically I paid
it's a range. The Yellowstone trip is an add-on, and it's a range between like 460 and 600. And the reason is it depends on how many people come with us and how many we share the bed and breakfast cost with. But we're going to stay in bed and breakfast for 2 nights, and we're providing transportation, so you don't have to have wheels. And so we're going to take 2 vans of 7 people each. And
okay, now that makes sense from a logistics. I didn't know if it was that price minus the $495 I initially did, or if it was that additional. Now I get it. It's in front of the Confluence, so it's basically a whole nother piece. That makes sense.
It's after the Confluence.
Well, after, okay.
It's a whole nother piece, 2 more nights. So it's 2 nights in a bed and breakfast, the travel, the food, for that 2 nights, and plus the marvelous interaction with the organizers of the Confluence, most of whom will be present. I don't think Colleen will be there, given her age, but the rest of us will be there. And to me, it's just a once in a lifetime opportunity to go through Yellowstone with someone like Tim Holmes, because he's lived there all his life. He knows lots about it. He'll probably do some art on the trip. I know you had in mind a portrait by Tim, and he's going to be quite busy this whole week, but so he's not going to finish a portrait in this week. But
well, and we'll see too. That totally makes sense, because the logistics. Thanks for the clarification, because I was trying to figure out, well, how is another 500 and something going to go in? Where are you going to fit that in the Confluence? It's outside of it. Now I get it.
Yeah, it's not part of the Confluence.
That now I see the value, and now I see. Okay, it's not just like, okay, here we're going to take this afternoon for 5. Yeah, got it.
No, it's going to be a 2-day tour of Yellowstone, and some other locals will be on the trip also. And so it's going to be, a private guided tour, and they highly recommend against you getting a rental car and think you're going to keep up with the vans, because what happens apparently in Yellowstone is you'll be driving along, and all of a sudden there'll be a bear ripping up a fish, and somebody will see that and they'll stop and want to watch the fish getting ripped apart, and that stops the whole procession. And
that reminds me of Colorado, when I take people up the mountain. I'm like, okay, we need to be careful of the gappers and the gapers. The gappers are the ones who really don't do anything but like this with traffic. They don't get how blood cells work. The gapers are the ones who are going like 4 miles an hour, and their just mouth is wide open agape, staring up at the mountains. But while they're wandering around in their car on the highway, because they're not looking where they're going.
Right. So highly recommended that you do the tour with us in the van. And I'm going to be doing that. Tim's going to be doing that. And I'm sure we'll switch off so that you don't have to stay with the same crew both days.
Well, and the dolmens too, I think
that's going to be interesting. That's before the confluence. That is part of the confluence. It's actually a free part of the confluence,
which is just amazing. And that's I mean, they were discovered, what, 6 years ago?
6 years ago. And these are rock formations that look like Stonehenge, but they're in the Rocky Mountains above Helena, Montana, and they were only discovered about 6 years ago. And nobody's figured out how they got there or why they are there at this point of time. I mean, it's not a Stonehenge type of situation where we know there was human activity. Stonehenge, we know humans did that, but one of these stones is 53 feet high, and
they must have used the vans.
Who knows? Nobody knew about it until 6 years ago. So it's going to be a very interesting part of the weekend, and it actually begins before the formal beginning of the confluence, but it'll be very good, I'm sure.
Nice.
So I'm glad you enjoyed the marriage counseling, Justin. I hope you didn't need it.
Yes.
But good luck. Anyway, peace until next week, and I'll see you on Wednesday, Jordan.
Yeah, sounds good.
Right. And if for our other viewers, we're talking about the Advanced Reading Group, which meets every Wednesday at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. And so for those of you in Europe, that's a much more amenable time to do a meeting. It is not on YouTube. We do not do it publicly. It's a private session. We do record it, but we open the kimono a little bit more in the Advanced Reading Group, and so we do not publish it on the YouTube. So you have to, if you want to attend, you have to do it on Zoom. And so I've given you the links for that. You can do that. And for Europe, it's pretty ideal time. It starts in the early evening. And we've been at it for, I don't know, like 4 years now. And we seem to have attracted a lot of folks to it. So I hope you join us. Peace. Take care. Good luck. Good luck with the plaza, Jordan.
Thanks. It's actually just my federal EIN. I can't get the screenshot to go. There must be a security thing, so we probably have to just wait till it comes in the mail. They need a hard copy, and I'm like, well, can you just have me print this photo I took with my phone? No, we need something, so it's like getting a building permit. You just step by step. So I'm just down to 2 hard copies of 2 numbers. So
any bureaucracy